Thank you, Federico Razzoli, calling in from London. Hi there, Federico.
Hi there, it's great to be here.
Likewise, so the Connect engine, I'm trying to go back to the basics here. Migration is a common denominator of many of our talks here at the MariaDB Server Fest 2020. Is Connect primarily for migration or only for migration, or what's the basic use case?
Well, migration is surely one of the use cases, but it's not the only one. For example, you could have a Connect table in which you regularly import data from elsewhere, maybe from some remote service or other technologies. And then you can, again, import data regularly and keep all the data in MariaDB to take advantage of the power of SQL. Or the opposite, of course, you could even export data regularly to have them in some other technology.
So this is not a read-only thing. So the Connect engine, just to emphasize the basics, you can read and write, can't you?
Yes, exactly. You can read and write. For example, if you have a table which points to a remote DBMS, you can insert data.
Can you also like create a new table in a remote place? Like, can you run DDL over it?
No, you cannot create or drop or alter existing remote tables. And I think it's correct because otherwise it would be a bit dangerous.
So speaking of dangerous, one of the use cases here is, of course, to migrate data off proprietary databases. So is this somehow open source license magic that through the use of the Connect engine, you can automatically read proprietary databases?
It would be interesting, but no, I don't think there is any magic here. So you have to already have some running, for example, Oracle instance, which already has a license, which is valid.
Okay, so this is clearly for on top of an existing solution, and it's both for import and for export. I have a technical question here. Does it make any sense to connect to MySQL this way? Like we have the same protocol mostly and the same data types. So does it make sense to connect with MySQL?
Yes, exactly for the same reasons you said. The protocol is more or less the same. Connect is totally able to use MySQL native protocol. MariaDB and MySQL have the same data types, so you can easily connect to remote MySQL table.
Okay, so you said that the DDL doesn't work. You cannot create tables externally, but what about creating indexes for them? Is that possible? Or would the original files then be somehow modified?
Yes, there is some limited support to indexes. You mentioned the case of of files, and well, simply indexes are created in a separate file, so the original data file, for example, a CSV, is not modified.
Right. And what if my CSV file has malformed rows? Can I connect to a CSV file that is actually containing bad data?
Yes, you can actually configure that. You can decide how many errors you are going to tolerate before your operations simply return an error.
Cool. So looking back at the Connect engine, it was created in France by a developer called Olivier Bertrand. So Olivier Bertrand is one of the biggest contributors to the MariaDB server code base used with this Connect engine. I understand, I asked you beforehand whether you met him. You said no, but do you have any greetings to Olivier Bertrand?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, I hope to meet him at some point. At the first opportunity. And I want to tell him thanks for the great plugin you produced. and hope to get in touch sometime soon.
So what do your users, your customers say about the Connect engine?
Every time I mention Connect with a customer and I explain what Connect is and what it does, they are amazed because it actually solves concrete problems. And I don't have an explanation of why it isn't much more used than it actually is.
So you think it deserves many, many more users because the use cases are so prevalent?
Absolutely, because in modern times, companies don't use only one technology. As good as it can be, they always use a mix of technologies, especially, for example, if they have microservices, they could have different microservices using different databases. Maybe they use something else for caching, something else for data warehousing. And so it's very common to have this problem of importing or exporting data to some other type of database.
Good. So more use cases or more use of the Connect engine is something you welcome. But what about performance? Isn't it always overhead to have an extra layer, like in this case, approaching an external database using the storage engine layer? So what's the performance penalty?
Well, of course, when you connect to a remote database, there is much more network activity involved. So the performance cannot be the same as querying a local table. And also you can have problems if you try to do complex joins between tables. But in that case, you're probably not using Connect in the best way.
Yeah, I would probably import stuff first before doing complex joins. But
Exactly.
Can you give some ballpark figure? Is it like 5% or 50% or 500% performance penalty for using Connect for external tables?
Oh, well, it really depends on your table, but on your queries. I would say that if your queries are very slow because they are analytical queries on big data sets, well, in that case, most of the time is took by your query itself, which is executed elsewhere. Using Connect is not necessarily an important overhead. It depends.
Okay, so you're saying somewhere between the 5% and 50% is the likely overhead.
Yes, it's very vague, but it depends on a lot of factors. So yes.
Yeah. So basically, the performance impact is not so high as for this to be something that you rule out. So for not just in a scenario where you do import export on a one time only basis, but for regular import export, you pointed that out, and the prerequisite for that is of course that performance is manageable, and you say it is.
Yes, if what you do is regular import export, you probably have a window of time during which you know that this operation is taking place and you are prepared to wait some time. Of course, it's completely a different story if you try to run regular queries on a Connect table, which connects to a remote data source. But again, that is not a correct usage of Connect, in my opinion.
Right. We heard earlier here today about the use case where some authentication tables, which were not too big, were being accessed by Richard Bensley from over the Connect engine. So he's also a big fan. So hey, we're all big fans of the Connect storage engine. Great work, Federico. You have some more presentations here coming up. So talk to you again soon. And thanks, Federico.
Thank you all. It was great. And thanks again to Olivier.